Welcome, everyone. I'm Kathy Nalivaiko. I'm president of the board here at the Ukrainian Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program, which is the official launch party for Ukrainian Masters. We're very proud to be sponsoring the event this evening. I'm just here to, again, say thanks for being here, thanks for supporting us, thanks for being part of our community. And before I turn the floor over to our musicians and to Solomiya Ivakhiv, who is the director of our Music at the Institute program, I'm just going to ask all of you to stand and join me in a moment of silence to honor all of those who have lost their lives in the war against the Russian invaders in Ukraine. Thank you. And without further ado, turning it over to Solomiya and our fabulous musicians and guests.
Good evening, dobry večer. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for tuning in. I know that people are watching us live. I'm very grateful to this community, to all of you, to my family and friends, to the Ukrainian Institute of America, President Kathy Nalivaiko, Executive Director Lydia Zeineker, the Board of Directors and members, as well as the Ukrainian National League of UNVLA, Ukrainian Women National League of America. Yes, thank you, Natalia Pavlenko, for believing in this project and for helping us to broadcast this event live. And Maria Sonevytsky is a friend. She's from Bard, and she will tell you a little bit about her colleague who is going to be joining her on a panel. But before you say a few words, I would like to share that Oksana, who will be talking with Maria about Ukrainian composers, is from Lviv, as I am. And as you can see later in the program, we will be performing Skoryk Sonata No. 2 that was commissioned by Maria's uncle, who was a composer, and his name is Igor Sonevytsky. So this is a family and friends affair, and thank you for being here.
Hi everybody, good evening, dobry večer. I want to thank, on behalf of both of us here, the invitation. It's just it's a really wonderful opportunity to be here with you tonight. I feel like we're going to be it's a tough act to follow. But my name is Maria Sonevytsky. I'm a professor at Bard College. And we're so fortunate to have with us tonight also Oksana Nesterenko sitting next to me. Peter Schmelz unfortunately fell ill and wasn't able to come, and miraculously Oksana has stepped in with her encyclopedic knowledge of Ukrainian music, so we're just extraordinarily lucky. The topic before us, the question of Ukrainian masters, is a difficult topic, and it raises a lot of really interesting questions that are also quite urgent today, given how contested narratives about Ukrainian history and belonging are at this moment. So I want to begin just by affirming that Ukraine has always been a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, and multi-linguistic space. We see a widespread phenomena today of people reevaluating, right, whether they are in fact in some way Ukrainian, what that means today. And there's been a real revaluation not only in music, but also in visual art, in literature, in film, about who sort of counts, right, in belonging to these canons of art. So we're going to offer some comments between these beautiful, moving musical performances, and we're going to structure our contributions as a kind of conversation, and also an invitation for all of us to think together about these difficult questions. So I'm going to begin just by thinking a little bit about hybridity. Hybridity is a kind of key term in a lot of decolonial, post-colonial thought. A lot of people thinking critically about Ukraine today are thinking a lot about what hybridity means. At its simplest, when we think about hybridity, I would just invite you to think about the hybrid identities that you embody, right, based on your heritage, based on where you grew up, the languages you speak, etc. And we can, of course, extend this to the lives of composers. So Serhiy Bortkiewicz, whose movement we just heard, was born in Kharkiv, which was then still part of the Russian Empire, is today, of course, a wonderful, defiant city in eastern Ukraine. He was born there in 1877. He trained in St. Petersburg, which was a very common, if not the only path for ambitious composers at the time to go to the Imperial Center. He moves to Leipzig and then is eventually buried in Vienna. So his route is circuitous. We'll hear a little more about that. So Oksana, my question for you. How do you think about the legacy of a figure like Bortkiewicz who existed between empires in this way?
Thank you, Maria. So I think first we often hear about composers who were born in Ukraine and went to study to St. Petersburg or Moscow as Russian composers. They are then appropriated as Russian. But this definitely does not define national identity of composer. My own research is on music in the Soviet Union, and I researched composers of art music throughout different republics. And for example, most Estonian composers would go to get their education to Moscow, St. Petersburg, but this never at any point influenced their identity as Estonian. So it's just one example from my research, but also we can look more broadly at the European canon of composers. For example, I'll just give two very famous examples. Handel is usually considered a German composer, but he was born in Germany, but he received his education in Italy, where he learned how to compose Italian opera in Italian language. And then his most prolific period was in England, where he composed his oratorios. So sometimes he's called German-British, but most of the time he's called German composer. But his life is just very similar to Serhiy Bortkiewicz in the sense. Also, Franz Liszt, he was born to German-speaking family in a village that is now a part of Austria. But he is considered a quintessentially Hungarian composer. He didn't even learn Hungarian. He studied with Italian and Czech composers, and his most prolific time was in Paris, where he composed all of these virtuosic piano music that we admire so much today. He's never called French composer. So if we consider this, apply this to Serhiy Bortkevych's life, he always wanted to have European identity, that's certain. Even when he studied in St. Petersburg, he was dreaming about going to Germany. And he went to Leipzig, he studied with German composers. Then he had really prolific years as composer in Berlin. And he was forced to go back to the Russian Empire at that time because of World War I in 1914. He passed St. Petersburg, but he didn't even think of staying there. He went all the way to his home village, his estate of his family in Kharkiv region. So his heart was always with Ukraine. So I just wanted to open this idea that geography of at any particular point of life of the composer doesn't define the national identity.
Yeah, thank you so much. So when we think about a project like this one, this beautiful album that's being presented tonight, right, we can really think about why is an album like this, right, necessary today. In our line of work in musicology, we sometimes talk about a reparative project, right? A project that fills in some of the blanks of history. We know all too well that the winners are the ones that usually get to write the history books, right, that everyone learns. And so a project like this, which insists that in fact a history of classical music existed in Ukraine and in fact flourished in the territory of Ukraine and embodied by people who brought Ukraine along with them on their journeys, is critically important. And I'll also add, as a person who has primarily studied popular music and folk music in Ukraine, That I think this is also especially important because precisely of the Russian imperial stereotype that for so long depicted the only music from Ukraine as peasant music, right, or as folk music, as a kind of low status music that might become inspirational for classical composers, but that the kind of classical tradition didn't in fact exist on the territory of Ukraine, and that's factually inaccurate. So I think it's so critically vital that we be repairing this historical record in this moment. All right, I think we will move to listen to the first movement from Viktor Kosenko's Sonata in A minor, Opus 18.
hard to speak after listening to such beautiful music, but I wanted to return to the question I asked before. How do we define national identity of a composer? And we already heard many examples of it can be defined by place of birth, by nationality of the parents of the composer, where they studied, the compositional school of their teachers, and so on. But there is really no consensus how we define it. So Viktor Kosenko, whose violin sonata you have just heard, was born in St. Petersburg in 1896 to a family of Ukrainian parents. So his father was an army officer, and they just had to relocate temporarily to St. Petersburg. But he decided to study composition in Warsaw. So he went to Poland, but he was forced to return to St. Petersburg, where he studied also with Russian composers. And eventually he returned to Ukraine, and he taught music at Kiev Lysenko Institute, which was almost like a conservatory at the time. And he performed a lot of Ukrainian music as a pianist. He was also a good pianist. He performed his music of his colleagues like Lev Korovitsky and Boris Litushinsky. So for me, what I just heard is an example of among many examples of the idea of why influences and compositional schools are problematic. So if you read a dictionary or in English, so Grove Dictionary of Music, for example, the author will tell you that they hear Russian traditions of Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, and Scriabin in Kosenko's music. But for me, I studied music. I started studying music in Lviv in music school, and what I hear, to me, it sounds more like it has influences from Mykola Lysenko, because that was my first education. I first learned about Mykola Lysenko's music. This points to this fact that how important it is to perform Ukrainian music more, because the more we hear of these works of Kosenko and Lysenko, the more we get used to the sound as Ukrainian, and the reaction to our ideas about the influences of this music will change.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, right, to consider that one can hear Tchaikovsky in this music, and we shouldn't deny anybody that if that's what they're hearing, but also if one has heard Lysenko, they might actually hear Lysenko too. And this sort of leads me to one of the big questions I've been asking, and I've been asked to reflect on since the full-scale invasion, which surrounds this question, right, about, well, let me start here. In 2022, I was invited by the San Francisco Opera to reflect on the ethics of staging the Tchaikovsky opera based on the Pushkin novella Eugene Onegin. And this caused me to really kind of reflect, right, on what I thought myself about these questions. And where I came to was not that we should cancel Tchaikovsky or anything like that, right? There's really no danger of that happening. So we can all put those pearl-clutching concerns aside. But instead to really consider why we always stage Tchaikovsky and why we never stage Lysenko, for example. Lysenko and Tchaikovsky were contemporaries in the 19th century. Compositionally, they influenced each other. There's some evidence of that. We know that they respected each other, right? Yet in our canon, we normally only hear about Tchaikovsky and we rarely hear about Lysenko. The same can be said, right, for Pushkin and Shevchenko. Pushkin is squarely in the literature, in the canon of great literature, right? Whereas Shevchenko hasn't quite made it into that canon. And so we might just begin to ask why, right? That becomes an opportunity to rethink the canon, right? Possibly to expand the canon and expand our definitions of the kinds of music that belong there. So this really touches on central questions about who is worthy of inclusion into the canon, who gets to decide how the canon is formed, and we can really start to think about how these are not objective or neutral processes, right? That they really require a critical approach, that empires have ways of kind of building their own PR campaigns, right, that the colonies don't usually have access to. So this is a bit of an awkward pivot, but I'm going to try to pivot here to think a little bit about Miroslav Skoryk, who's the last composer that we'll be hearing from tonight. Miroslav Skoryk is maybe most squarely in the canon of Ukrainian composers. One of the reasons I really respect and admire this composer is because he is also he was a very versatile composer. One of my favorite facts is that in 1963, he composed a pop song, which was the first Ukrainian twist. Yep, fun fact. And he's also very much associated with some of the iconic film scores of the Ukrainian 20th century, including Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, the very important Parajanov film. So my question, Oksana, for you is, how would you position Skoryk with respect to other composers of his generation?
Thank you. I have studied a lot of Skoryk's colleagues, and what is important to know about his work? So we do think about him as one of the major Ukrainian composers, but he lived in the Soviet Union most of his life, and he was forced to negotiate between the acceptable socialist realist style and modernist ideas. And his colleagues of his generation, of the 60th generation, who became famous abroad already in Europe in the 1960s, were composers Valentin Silvestrov, Leonid Grabovsky, and others who were not afraid of experimenting with musical styles, and they followed what was trendy in Europe at that time, which is this very avant-garde and non-traditional music. But Skoryk was thinking about music in modernist idioms, but he never followed that really radical path, like anti-Soviet, if we could say that. And if you look at his biography, then it becomes clear. When he was 7, his parents were deported to Siberia for 10 years, so he was forced to interrupt his musical early childhood musical studies, and this deportation, 10 years, really had a mark on his his relationship to Soviet regime. So he went, when they returned to Ukraine, he studied in Lviv Conservatory, but then he also did his graduate studies in Moscow Conservatory. And he returned and was the head of Composers Union, which was this official position. Because of this this difficult childhood, he had to kind of juggle between what he thought was acceptable in the Soviet Union and the music he would maybe otherwise compose. Maybe I'm just a little getting too complicated here, but the piece we will hear now is from 1991, and it's clear, obviously, that he wasn't thinking about socialist realism anymore. And we can see these influences later, how the experimentation and creativity of Ukrainian composers really burst after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So before we play the sonata that was actually dedicated to Maria's uncle, I would like to say a few words about Miroslav Skoryk, who was a family's friend. My grandparents were friends with him and his brother. And my grandma recalled that Miroslav was a very fun person. He loved to sit at the piano and play jazz and improvise. So you will hear some of it in the piece we are about to play. And also he was obsessed with Beethoven Moonlight Sonata. So you will hear some fragments of the Moonlight Sonata. If I may, not to interrupt the flow, but you know, I also have opinions, which I'm hoping you would like to hear. So Skoryk's family was sentenced to Siberia because they were called an enemy of the state, enemy of the people, and only upon Stalin's death they were allowed to come back to Western Ukraine. A few more things that I would like to share, that Gross Dictionary is outdated. And up to 2 years ago, everyone spelled Kyiv instead of K-Y-I-V, the Russian way, K-I-E-V. So same with the Gross Dictionary that has all the information that was presented by the winners, and they wrote the history and music history as well. And I would like to make a call to everyone who wants to contribute and petition them. Orchestras in US and chamber music societies pay attention to the composers that they are not promoting, but that they are presenting. And please do your research, because you will be surprised how many of them are Ukrainian. On that note, I would like to invite you all on April 19th to the Music at the Institute concert called Two Brothers, Two Faiths. Will present music of Yakimenko, Fedor Yakimenko, who had to flee the Soviets to Paris, and he died in hunger, but his brother had to change his last name, and he stayed in Ukraine. Fun fact, Yakimenko was the first teacher of another Ukrainian, Fedor Stravinsky. So there is so much work that has to be done. Fedor Stravinsky's father was a bass, I think, in Kyiv Opera. And if we are talking about Tchaikovsky, first of all, his one grandpa is 100% Ukrainian, and his last name was actually Chaika. But then in order to sound Russian, they added A, so they fit in more within, you know, the Russian environment and Russian culture. And his another grandpa was 100% French. So I'm always puzzled when I hear about the great Russian composer Petro Tchaikovsky, who is French and Ukrainian, but somehow he's called Russian. So I think it's a duty of all of us to bring the truth, because Kazimir Malevich, Archipenko, whose works we have upstairs, mathematicians, inventors, they were all labeled as non-Ukrainians, and we need to bring them back. So now Skoryk Sonata number 2.
influences. Did anyone hear the Vince Guaraldi gestures in there? Just me, Charlie Brown? Okay, yeah. So we're going to offer just a few last thoughts to finish out this beautiful event. Thank you again so much, Solomiya, for the invitation to participate. Oksana, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about how this discussion we're having tonight on the national identity of composers ties to your own research on 21st century Ukrainian composers today.
Thank you, Maria. I will just say a few words. First, we were discussing about these composers, Kosenko and Bortkiewicz, who lived in different places and crossed borders, and how can we define their identity as Ukrainian. But the situation with this hybridity and movement across borders remains the same in the 21st century. There are so many great, prolific composers in Ukraine today. And the younger ones, the ones who were born in the 80s and 90s, a lot of them moved to Europe for economic reasons, because it's easier to actually earn a living as a composer. So just two examples: Anna Korsun, great, really interesting composer. She moved from Ukraine to Berlin, and now she is called Berlin-based composer. And Maxim Shaligin, born in Ukraine, moved to Netherlands. He is now Ukrainian-Dutch composer. Hopefully he will still keep the Ukrainian part. But if we think about more closely to today, the impact of Russia's war on Ukraine on defining the future Ukrainian canon. A lot of composers from Ukraine had to move to Europe because of the war. It's very difficult to compose music when you hear sirens every hour. Some can still do that. Some just need to kind of more silence and more basic living conditions, and they move to Europe. They may decide to stay, right? And how will we call those composers in the future who will be in the canon? This is something that is, so we can see that the geographical trajectory of composers we discussed today and listen to the music today is similar. They had to move because of the wars, right, to different places.
Yeah, it's really striking, right, how Ukrainian composers historically in the 20th century, in the 19th century, and today, with their very many varied experiences of empire, of place, of statehood, I think offer us a lot of new and productive ways to think about national identity in music, not in strictly ethno-national or in strictly essentialist terms, but in fundamentally hybrid, right, and complex and human terms. So I think I will just echo what Solomiya said earlier, which is we really need more in-depth research. Of course, the scholar would say that, right? We need more in-depth research, we need more critical inquiry, and we certainly need to continue to listen to this really complex and lovely music that has been understudied and overlooked. So thank you for the opportunity to do that through this beautiful album that you've gifted us, and thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Maria and Oksana. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for watching. Please join us for the reception across the hall. And I also would like to thank my partner in crime, Steve Beck, who learned a lot of Ukrainian music. And also the Ukrainian Masters idea was his master idea. So thank you all so much. See you across the street.
Ой, браво!